Hello, today we're going to be looking at a logic problem from Google Code Jam called Magic Trick. The idea behind this problem is that there's a magician who arranges 16 cards into a square grid, and he asks a volunteer to choose a card and tell him which row that card is in. So the magician rearranges the cards and asks the volunteer again the same question: which row is the card in? And then with the answers to these two questions, the magician can determine which card the volunteer chose. So for the input, the first line tells us how many test cases there's going to be. Each test case starts with a line containing an integer, the answer to the first question. The next 4 lines represent the first arrangement of the cards. Each contains 4 integers separated by a single space. The next line contains the answer to the second question, and the following 4 lines contain the second arrangement in that same format. The output's going to be one of 3 things. If there's a single card the volunteer could have chosen, we're going to be outputting the number of the card. If there are multiple cards the volunteer could have chosen, it's going to be bad magician. If there are no cards consistent with the volunteer's answers, we're going to be outputting volunteer cheated. Here's the sample input and output, which we'll be using to test our solution. Alright, now that we understand the problem, let's begin to code our solution. I'm going to name the class Magic Trick, because that's the name of the problem. And we need a main method. And we're going to be using a scanner in order to scan in the user's input. I'm putting it as a static object because we're going to be using this not only in the main method, but in a helper method. So instead of passing it in as a parameter, I'll just make it as an object up here, which we can access from any method. Now, the first line of input is the number of test cases, which is an integer. So we'll get the next line of input and convert it to an integer. And for each test case, start at 1, go all the way up to and including t. We're going to be doing the following. First, we're going to be handling the input. Then we want to find common cards. And then we want to print the result. So to handle the input, first we started by getting the volunteer's first guess. So we'll call this guess 1. And this is an integer. Same as before. And next we want to get the layout of the cards, which is a 4x4 grid of integers. And we're going to create a helper method to help us do this. So I'll call this cards1. And we'll have a helper method which we'll call readCards. We'll make that in a few moments. Next, we want to get guess2. Same as before. And once again, we're going to read in another grid of cards using the same method. Okay. Next, we'll be creating the method that actually reads the cards. We'll put it down here. It needs to be static because we're calling it from another static method, and it's going to be returning a 2-dimensional array of integers. And we'll call it readCards. Now, first we need to actually make the array of cards. And it's a 4x4 grid, so we put those in here, 4x4. And we're going to be reading it row by row. So int row equals 0, row is less than 4. And for each row, we need to get the next line. So read the next line from the input, and we're going to be splitting it by spaces. So what this does is it takes the next line of input, splits it by spaces, and puts it into an array of strings. Now those strings are actually just numbers in string form, or text form. So we need to convert those strings to integers, storing them in our 2-dimensional array. So we'll iterate through the columns. So for each card in the line, or each column, we're going to be storing it in our array. Row, column, equals integer.value of, oh, this should be the column number. All right, so this fills the array with a 4-dimensional grid of cards, and we're going to be returning the cards. Now that we've finished taking care of the input, we can go on to find the common cards. So we write in all of the cards, but we don't actually care about all of them. All we care about is the cards that the volunteer picked. So we're going to store those. Picked cards 1 is cards 1, and then we take the row that the volunteer picked. Now, since the volunteer's guesses were 1 based, so if they wanted the first row, they just said 1. The third row, they said 3. If we think of this in terms of arrays, arrays are numbered starting at 0. So if we want to grab the first row, we actually need to grab it at index 0. So we need to subtract 1 from here. We're going to do the same thing for the second guess. So we have our picked cards. Now we're going to be iterating through these picked cards. So we want to iterate through these. We're going to be using a for each loop. So what this does is it just goes through the array and gives you 1 card at a time. And we'll have a nested for loop here. We'll do the same thing with the other array. Okay. So what we're doing is we're comparing every possible pair of cards together. And what we want to do is we want to see if any of these cards match. Because if they match, that means that they're potentially the card that the volunteer picked. If card 1 is equal to card 2, then we want to do something. So think back to the problem and 3 different outputs we can have. If there are no common cards, the volunteer cheated. If there's 1 common card, we're going to be outputting its number. And if there's more than 1 card in common, then the magician did a bad job. So outside of this array, we actually want to count how many common cards we have. Start this at 0. And we also want to hold on to a card that was in common, because if there's just 1, we need to print that out. Call this common card. And we have to initialize it to something, so let's initialize it to -1. Okay, so if we find 2 cards that are the same, that means that the number of common cards has increased by 1. So I'll increment it there. And we can set common card to equal, doesn't matter which one, card 1 or card 2, they're the same, so card 1. Okay, so that finds how many cards are in common, and if there's just 1, then we'll know what that common card was. Let's go on to print the result. There's going to be 3 different cases, as we mentioned before. So if n number of common cards is equal to 0, result equals volunteer cheated. And another case is if the number of common cards is equal to 1, and the result equals string.value of common cards. This takes the integer, formats that as a string, and that's a result. Otherwise, this means that there's more than 1 card in common, and the magician did a bad job. Bad magician. Note that I didn't use any curly braces around these if statements. I could have put curly braces like that, but when you only have 1 line that follows an if statement or else if, or even a for loop, something like that, then it's not actually necessary. So I omitted them just to make the code look a little bit cleaner. Now, what we want to do is we want to print out the line, and it needs to be formatted in a specific way. So you have case, number, And then what we need to do is put in the case's number. So we're going to use %d, and because we're using printf, %d is a format specifier. So we can put in a number here. So I, the case number. The D means number. And then we want a colon, and then we want the result. Space, and then the result. So S stands for string. Put the result in there. And we also need to put a new line character. Stop the line and go on to the next one. And this should work. So now we can head on over to the terminal and try to compile this. So to compile it, we'll use javac magictrick.java. So we've got a couple errors here. It says it cannot find the symbol scanner. So if we look at our code, we used scanner object, but in order to use scanner, we need to import java.util. So we can do that. Let's try again. All right, it compiles. Now we can run this against the sample input that was provided in the problem. I went ahead and downloaded it and put it in a file called test.in. We'll run our program, and we'll feed it that file. And the output is 7, bad magician, and volunteer cheated, which if you look at the problem, that's what we were supposed to get, so that's good. Now that we have what seems to be a functional program, we can generate the output to the actual data. I downloaded this and put it in a file called a small practice.in. If we run this, it puts it all out on the console. It seems to work. What we want to do is put this in an output file, so we'll call this a.out. Okay. So now that this is stored in a file, this is the file we're going to be using to upload to Google Code Jam, and Google Code Jam will be judging our solution to see if it's correct. So we can head on over to Google Code Jam and do that now. So I selected the file and we can go ahead and submit it. And the judge's response was correct, so we did it. Awesome. So I hope that you had a fun time solving this problem today. The real question though is, did you figure out how this magic trick actually works? You can post your answer in the comments, and I look forward to solving another problem with you next time. Bye.